In the late 16th century, the world was cracking open. The very fabric of reality, as Europe knew it, was being torn asunder. Maps were being redrawn, not in the slow, deliberate cadence of decades, but in the frantic, breathless span of single years. A new age of sail, of gunpowder, and of naked, unadulterated ambition was colliding with ancient, isolated worlds. This new world, the Americas, was a terrifying, blank space on the parchment. A place of tantalizing rumor, of mythical gold, of fountains promising eternal youth, and of shadows concealing unspeakable monsters. It was the great prize in a Cold War that was rapidly heating, a bitter ideological struggle between the global Catholic superpower of Spain and the small, defiant, Protestant island nation of England. And England was losing, desperately. Spain was an empire on which the sun never set, a colossus bestriding the globe. From the silver mines of Potosi in Bolivia, a literal mountain of silver, and the plundered gold mines of the vanquished Aztecs, a relentless river of treasure flowed into the insatiable coffers of King Philip II. This unimaginable wealth funded his armies, the unstoppable tercios, the finest fighting force in Europe, his vast fleets, and his Holy Inquisition, an instrument of terrifying doctrinal purity. Spain had claimed all of the New World, based on the Papal Bull of 1493, which had, with the stroke of a pen, divided the entire globe between Spain and Portugal. In their eyes, any other nation setting foot in the Americas was not an explorer, but a heretic, a pirate, and a trespasser deserving of immediate extermination. England, by contrast, was a young, fragile, and perpetually insecure nation. Its queen, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, ruled with a precarious, calculating brilliance. She was a Protestant monarch in a roiling sea of Catholic enemies. She had been formally declared a heretic and excommunicated by the Pope himself, a decree that effectively made her assassination a holy act. Philip of Spain saw it as his sacred, God-given duty to depose her and return England to the Catholic fold. He funded intricate plots against her life, like the infamous Babington plot, which led directly to the execution of her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, a final, irrevocable act that sealed Philip's resolve for a full-scale invasion. Elizabeth, a master of realpolitik, knew she could not fight Spain's grand, battle-hardened armies head-on. She was a pragmatist, a survivor above all else. She had spent her own youth in the shadow of the executioner's axe, an experience that taught her the subtle, dangerous dance of power. She understood its nuances, and she knew the stark limits of her own. Her fleet was a ragtag collection of retrofitted merchant vessels and fishing boats, no match for the towering, gilded Spanish galleons. Her treasury was perpetually strained, teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. So she fought a different kind of war. A shadow war. A war of whispers and plausible deniability. She funded sea dogs, privateers, state-sponsored pirates like the audacious Sir Francis Drake, to bleed Spain dry, to intercept the treasure fleets, to raid their wealthy coastal cities like Cartagena and Santo Domingo, and to finance her kingdom with stolen gold. These men were her heroes and her deniable assets, celebrated and disavowed in the same breath. When the furious Spanish ambassador stormed into her court demanding Drake be hanged as the pirate he was, she instead knighted him on the deck of his ship, the Golden Hind, a vessel grotesquely laden with plundered Spanish treasure. But this was not a long-term strategy. It was reactive, not proactive. It was a parasite, not a foundation. England needed more. It needed a source of wealth that wasn't just plunder. It needed timber for its nascent navy. It needed exotic goods, sassafras, tobacco, furs. It needed a land of its own. It needed a strategic base in this new world, a pirate's nest from which to launch attacks on the Spanish fleets, and a New England to build a lasting empire. She turned to her most ambitious, flamboyant courtier, the quintessential Renaissance man, brilliant, arrogant, dashing, and obsessive. A poet, a soldier, a spy, an alchemist, and a ruthless capitalist. His name was Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was the New World's greatest promoter and most fervent evangelist. He had never set foot there himself, but he saw its potential with a clarity that bordered on prophetic delusion. He was a master of propaganda, a spinner of glorious tales. He saw an England, overflowing with the poor and landless population, a direct result of the enclosure movement that turned common farmland into private sheep pastures, and he saw a vast, empty continent waiting to be filled with English souls. He saw a chance to make a colossal personal fortune, to serve his queen, and to write his name across the globe for all eternity. He obtained a royal charter, a 6-year monopoly, to discover, search, find out, and view such remote, heathen and barbarous lands, not actually possessed of any Christian prince. Raleigh, the visionary, never set foot there himself, but in 1587, he sponsored his most ambitious mission yet. A corporation, the governor and assistants of the city of Raleigh in Virginia. This was not just an expedition. It was a business venture, a joint stock company. He recruited investors, promising them vast 40,000-acre estates. And he recruited colonists. 117 men, women, and children. They were not all grizzled adventurers. They were families. Smiths, tailors, coopers, bakers. They were the middle class, the dreamers, the desperate, seeking a social mobility utterly impossible in the rigid, hierarchical structure of Elizabethan England. They signed on to plant the first permanent English colony in North America. They were led by Governor John White, an artist, a cartographer, a man of sensitivity and observation, not a soldier. He had been to this land before and had painted its inhabitants with a stunning, humanistic eye, capturing their dignity and culture. They landed on a small, sandy, unforgiving island, a thin, vulnerable strip of land, lashed by hurricanes, surrounded by shallow, treacherous shoals that made it a death trap for deep draft ships. It was a place of buzzing insects, dense, mysterious forests, and hidden dangers. They called it Roanoke. 3 agonizing years later, John White returned. He had sailed 3,000 miles on a desperate resupply mission, a journey he had begged for, a journey delayed by a catastrophic, existential war. When his ship finally anchored at dusk, he scanned the shoreline, looking for the warm, welcoming lights of the settlement. He saw nothing but impenetrable blackness. He heard no voices on the wind, no barking dogs, no gunfire of welcome. He heard only the relentless crash of the surf and the lonely, mournful cry of the gulls. The air was heavy and silent, a palpable, terrifying emptiness. He ordered his men to play familiar English songs on a trumpet, to let the colonists know their countrymen were home. The music echoed across the dark, still water, into the silent, black woods. No answer came. At dawn, he rowed to shore. He found a scene not of violent destruction, but of profound, unsettling emptiness. The settlement was gone. The houses were gone. Not burned, not smashed in an attack. They had been carefully, methodically, deliberately dismantled. The timbers, the doors, the roof beams. All gone. The heavy equipment, the cannons, the iron shot. Gone. The small boats, the pinnaces they would have used to explore the rivers and sounds. Gone. He found chests that he had buried for safekeeping, chests containing his own precious paintings, his maps, his life's work. They had been dug up, broken open, their contents scattered and ruined by the relentless weather, a sign of looting, but by whom? There was no sign of a battle. No skeletons. No bloodstains on the ground. No unburied bones. No fresh graves. If they had been massacred, where were the 117 dead? It was as if the entire colony had been a collective dream, now vanished without a trace. The only clue was a single word, carved into a large wooden palisade post, part of a defensive fence they had built after he left, a word that has haunted history, archaeology, and the human imagination for over 400 years. CROATOAN. This is the story of the Lost Colony of Roanoke, America's oldest and most chilling mystery, a story of 117 people who walked out of their lives, out of history, and into enduring legend. To understand how an entire colony could simply disappear, we must first understand why it was there in the first place. It was not the first attempt. It was, in fact, the third. And the location itself was a curse from the very beginning. The entire enterprise was born of Raleigh's grand vision, and that vision was built on a single, beautifully flawed report. In 1584, Raleigh sent his first mission, a reconnaissance voyage, led by Captains Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow. They were not looking for a place to build a city. They were looking for a paradise to sell to investors. They landed not at Roanoke, but further south, on the Outer Banks. And they found their paradise, or so they claimed. The soil, Barlow wrote with poetic license, was the most plentiful, sweet, fruitful and wholesome of all the world. The trees were so full of grapes, so plentiful, that I think in all the world the like abundance is not to be found. And the people, Barlow described the coastal Algonquians, the Secotans, as most gentle, loving, and faithful, void of all guile and treason, and such as live after the manner of the Golden Age. The local chief's wife, he wrote, was very sober and modest, a behavior very graceful. This was the marketing campaign. This was the sales brochure. It was exactly what Raleigh wanted and needed to hear. It was a description of Eden, a land ripe for the taking, inhabited by a gentle, noble people who would welcome them with open arms. To seal the deal, Amadas and Barlow brought 2 lords of the country back to England, not as prisoners, but as cultural attaches, as living proof of this new world's potential. Their names were Manteo and Wanchese. In London, they were an absolute sensation. They were dressed in fine English clothes, taught English, and presented at court to the magnificent Queen Elizabeth herself. They were the living, breathing embodiment of Raleigh's dream. Raleigh assigned his top scientist, a brilliant polymath named Thomas Harriot, to study them. Harriot, a genius on par with Galileo, learned their language, and in doing so, learned about their complex politics, their spiritual beliefs, their land. He created a phonetic alphabet for their language. He learned of their gods, their social structures, and their ancient blood feuds. But Manteo and Wanchese had 2 very different, profoundly consequential reactions to England. Manteo, who was from the CROATOAN tribe, was fascinated and impressed. He saw the overwhelming power of England. The tall ships, the immense stone buildings, the gleaming metal weapons, the sheer, teeming number of people. He saw them as powerful, almost godlike beings. He decided that alliance with these people was the only viable future for his own. He became their greatest, most loyal ally. Wanchese, from the Roanoke tribe, was different. He was equally intelligent, but he was deeply suspicious, his eyes seeing beyond the pageantry. He saw the dark, festering underbelly of London. He saw the filthy, disease-ridden streets, the crushing poverty, the rampant sickness. He saw the public executions at Tyburn, the debtors' prisons, a city overflowing with landless, hungry, desperate people. He saw the brutal social stratification, the beggars in the gutters while bejeweled lords passed by in carriages, and he saw their military power not as a promise of alliance, but as a clear and present threat of invasion. He saw the Tower of London, not as a palace, but as a fortress of absolute power and menace. He realized the English were not coming as friends. They were coming to take, to consume, to dominate. This fundamental split, between Manteo's trust and Wanchese's burgeoning suspicion, would ultimately seal the colony's fate. Raleigh, buoyed by Barlow's glowing report and Manteo's apparent friendship, immediately funded a second mission. In 1585, a year later, he sent a fleet. This was not a colony of settlers. This was a military garrison. It was a fleet of 500 men, soldiers, sailors, and specialists, led by Raleigh's cousin, the ferocious and hot-tempered Sir Richard Grenville. The governor of the new fort would be Ralph Lane, a battle-hardened, ruthless veteran of the bloody, genocidal wars in Ireland. The mission's chief scientist, Thomas Harriot. Its artist and mapmaker, John White. Manteo and Wanchese were on board, returning home. It was a disaster from the very start. Grenville's flagship, the Tiger, ran aground on the treacherous shoals, ruining most of their vital food supplies. The seed corn for planting was soaked with salt water, rendering it useless. They landed on Roanoke Island. Why Roanoke? It was a terrible, almost inexplicable choice. The inlet was too shallow for big ships. The soil was sandy and poor, not good for sustained farming. It was, however, militarily defensible, an island that could be fortified. And this was, above all, a military mission. Lane built a small, star-shaped fort. Fort Raleigh and his 100 soldiers, who were not farmers but professional fighters, immediately began to demand food from the local people. The local chief, Wingina, who ruled Roanoke, was at first accommodating, even welcoming. He remembered the Golden Age interactions with Amadas and Barlow. He saw the English as potential powerful allies against his own tribal enemies, the powerful Nusi tribe to the north. But the soldiers' demands became relentless, an endless hunger. They were soldiers. They did not work the land. They did not plant. They took. They were veterans of the brutal Irish Wars, and they brought that savage, colonial mindset with them. In Ireland, the English had perfected a form of colonial warfare that involved total subjugation, the systematic burning of crops, and the extirpation of the local populace. They saw the natives not as equals, but as savages, subhumans to be dealt with through overwhelming force. Wanchese had returned to his village, and his worst warnings had come true. The English were not gods. They were here to devour them. Relations soured immediately. The English, paranoid and trigger-happy, accused the natives of stealing a single silver cup. In retaliation, Sir Richard Grenville led a heavily armed detachment to a native village and burned it to the ground, destroying food stores and homes. This was the catastrophic act that destroyed any hope for the colony. Grenville then sailed back to England, promising to return with supplies. He left Ralph Lane and 100 men stranded, completely surrounded by people who now, justifiably, hated and feared them. The winter was brutal, unrelenting. The soldiers starved. They had no food of their own. Their only hope was to trade with, or more often, steal from, the natives. Thomas Harriot wrote that the soldiers were on the very brink of starvation. They were forced to eat their own hunting dogs, an act of sheer desperation. Disease, likely influenza or smallpox brought unwittingly by the English, also began to ravage the native villages, which the natives, understandably, blamed on the English and their invisible bullets, a powerful metaphor for germ warfare. Wingina, the chief, had had enough. He saw the English, weakened by hunger, as a threat that must be eliminated before they recovered. He was also a savvy political leader. He realized the English were mortal, that their guns were not thunder from the gods, and that they died from disease and hunger just as his own people did. He changed his name to Pimisipan, a name signifying his new, open hostility and his role as a strategic planner. He organized a confederation of local tribes. His plan was cunning: to cut off all food supplies, wait for the English to scatter in small, vulnerable groups in search of food, and then ambush them, one by one, annihilating them piecemeal. But Ralph Lane, the hardened veteran, found out. Manteo, loyal to the English, may have warned him. Lane did not wait to be attacked. He was a product of the Irish Wars, where the English practiced a policy of total, preemptive brutality. On June 1, 1586, Lane and his men faked a friendly visit to Wingina's capital, Decimonkpunk. When the signal was given, they opened fire in a sudden, shocking act of betrayal. Lane himself, in the chaos, cornered the chief. He beheaded Wingina Pimisipan in front of his terrified people. The garrison had declared all-out war on the very people they depended on for survival. Starving, their supplies gone, and now surrounded by a unified, enraged enemy, the colony was on the very brink of total collapse and annihilation. Then, a miracle, an act of divine providence or sheer luck. A week later, a massive fleet appeared offshore. It was Sir Francis Drake, the Queen's favorite pirate, fresh from a massive, triumphant raid on the Spanish in the Caribbean, his holds bulging with loot. Drake, seeing their desperate, emaciated state, offered them a choice. He would give them a new ship, a month's supplies, and they could stay and tough it out. Or, they could have a ride home, back to England. Lane and his men, to a man, took the ride home. They abandoned the fort, their mission, their claim. They had been in America for 10 nightmarish months. The first English colony on Roanoke was a complete, unmitigated, bloody failure. When John White, the governor of the 1587 mission, set sail, he knew all of this. He had been there. He had seen the land with his own artist's eyes. He had witnessed the violence firsthand. He had seen the starvation and the paranoia. He was an artist, a chronicler, not a soldier. He had painted the local people, their ceremonies, their families, their villages, with a deep, humanistic eye, seeing them as people, not savages. He knew Roanoke was a death trap, a cursed place. His plan was fundamentally different. He was not bringing 100 soldiers. He was bringing 117 settlers. Men, women, and children. His own pregnant daughter and her husband. They were not building a military fort. They were building a new life, a permanent community. They were bringing their furniture, their tools, their hopes, their future. They were shareholders in the city of Raleigh. Each man promised 500 acres of land. And, most importantly, they were not going to Roanoke. Raleigh had learned his lesson. The new charter was for a different place entirely. Their destination was 200 miles north, in the deep, safe, deep water harbor of the Chesapeake Bay. A place with rich, fertile soil, deep ports that could accommodate large ships, and, crucially, no history of violence with the native population. But they never made it. The mission was plagued, and arguably doomed, by a man named Simon Fernandez. A Portuguese navigator, a former pirate. He was the pilot of the fleet, and perhaps the most skilled navigator in all of England. He had also been the pilot for the disastrous 1585 mission. He was a man of dark and ambiguous loyalties, a shadowy figure. Many, including John White, suspected he was a secret agent for the Spanish, paid to sabotage the English colony. He was a privateer at heart, a man of action, and he was restless. The tedious contract to found a sleepy colony was boring, unprofitable. He wanted to hunt for Spanish treasure ships, to win glory and gold. For reasons that remain a dark, enduring mystery, Fernandez refused to sail them to the Chesapeake. He abruptly anchored at Roanoke. He claimed it was too late in the season to sail north. He claimed he had to leave immediately, to go hunt for Spanish treasure ships. He forced the 117 bewildered and terrified colonists off the ships onto the familiar, cursed sand. They were stranded in the exact place John White never wanted to be, the place he knew meant almost certain death. They found the ruins of Ralph Lane's fort. The houses were overgrown with vines. They found the bones of a single, anonymous man. After Lane had left, Sir Richard Grenville had finally returned with his promised supply ships. He found the fort abandoned. Unwilling to give up England's claim, he left a small holding party of 15 men, a skeleton crew, and sailed away. Those 15 men were never seen again. The bones they found were the only testament to their grim fate, killed, they later learned, by Wanchise's people. It was a terrible, terrifying omen of what might await them. But they were settlers, not soldiers. They began to rebuild the wrecked houses, to make a home. They had Matteo with them, their only true friend in this vast, unknown land. Matteo, who had been to England twice, was baptized and named Lord of Roanoke and assimilation by the English, the first and last native peer of the realm in the New World. This was a desperate attempt to secure an alliance, to create a legitimate government, to make Matteo their proxy ruler and protector. But Matteo's friendship and newfound title could not fully protect them. Wanchese and his warriors, now in charge after Wangina's death, were openly, vehemently hostile. They saw the English return as a second invasion, a provocation that could not be tolerated. Weeks later, one of John White's men, George Howe, was crabbing alone in the shallow waters. He was ambushed, found dead, his body bristling with 16 arrows, a message of utter contempt and hatred. The colony was in immediate, dire crisis. They were in the wrong place. They were surrounded by enemies. And their supplies, which were only meant for the voyage, were running dangerously low. Dendrochronology, the sophisticated study of tree rings, has since told us something John White couldn't have possibly known. The years 1587 to 1589 were the years of the most devastating, catastrophic drought in that region in 800 years. The corn crops would have failed utterly. The natives, starving themselves, would have had absolutely no food to spare, to trade, or to give. This environmental catastrophe, more than any human enemy, may have ultimately sealed their fate. The colonists held a desperate, fraught meeting. They decided that someone had to go back to England. Someone had to get help, to sound the alarm. Someone had to tell Sir Walter Raleigh what Fernandez had done and beg for an immediate, massive relief mission. They chose their governor, John White. White refused, vehemently. He argued that it would look like he was abandoning them, like a captain deserting his sinking ship. He had just brought his own daughter, Eleanor, and his son-in-law, Ananias Dare, to this new world. He would not leave them, his own flesh and blood, in this peril. But the colonists insisted, unanimously. They put the formal demand in writing, a signed petition. This was a legal act, a corporate decision, absolving him of his command and any potential charge of desertion. Only he, John White, had the authority, the personal connections, and the absolute trust of Raleigh to get the ships and supplies they so desperately needed. His departure was their only, slim hope for survival. He finally, tragically, heartbrokenly, agreed. Just days before he left, on August 18, 1587, his daughter Eleanor gave birth. It was a girl, the first English child born in the Americas. They named her Virginia Dare. John White, a new grandfather, held his tiny granddaughter for less than 10 days. He left his daughter, his infant granddaughter, and 115 other souls on that hostile, drought-stricken beach. He promised them he would return. He promised he would be back by the next spring, with a fleet of ships and a mountain of supplies. John White's promise would become his lifelong, waking nightmare. He arrived in England in November 1587, to a nation in a state of total, war-fueled panic. King Philip II of Spain, furious at years of English piracy and enraged by the execution of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, was building the single greatest naval force in human history. The invincible Spanish Armada, Queen Elizabeth, in a desperate bid to defend her kingdom, declared a full, total embargo. No ocean-going ships were allowed to leave English ports. They were all commandeered, impressed into service for the coming war. John White was trapped, a prisoner of geopolitics. He tried, desperately, frantically. He wrote impassioned letters, he petitioned the Queen and her Privy Council, he begged his patrons. In 1588, he managed to secure 2 small, unseaworthy flyboats, and fill them with precious supplies. They were not warships. They were immediately attacked by French pirates, who swarmed the vulnerable vessels. The ships were looted, their cargo stolen. White himself was wounded in the fierce fighting. They limped back to England, defeated, humiliated, and empty-handed. Then, the Armada came. A great and mighty wind, a Protestant wind, blew, scattering the massive Spanish fleet. England was saved, by skill, luck, and weather. But the war dragged on, a long, draining conflict of attrition. A year went by. 2 years. 3. For 3 long, agonizing years, John White was a ghost in the corridors of power in London, a man possessed, a man obsessed, begging every courtier, every admiral, every merchant, for a single ship. For 3 endless years, 117 people waited on a beach 3,000 miles away, scanning the empty horizon, their fine English clothes turning to rags, their supplies dwindling to nothing, their hope fading with each passing, lonely day. Finally, in 1590, Sir Walter Raleigh, his own fortunes now waning, his favor with the Queen lost after he secretly married one of her ladies-in-waiting, could not fund a proper, dedicated rescue mission. He essentially sold his interest in the colony. He convinced a group of privateers, pirates, to take White along as a passenger. It was not a relief mission. It was a pirate fleet. Its purpose was profit, not rescue. He was, essentially, a hitchhiker on a mission of plunder. The captains were far more interested in hunting Spanish treasure ships in the Caribbean than in finding a lost colony. They spent the entire summer in the Caribbean, looting and plundering, an agonizing, heartbreaking delay for White. Finally, in August 1590, they anchored off the coast, near Roanoke. It was 3 years to the day since he had left. As they approached the island, they saw a column of smoke rising from the trees near the settlement. A good sign, they thought, a surge of wild hope. A signal fire. They rowed to shore, singing loud, familiar English songs, old English tunes, hoping for an answering shout, a wave, any sign of life. There was no answer, only the echo of their own voices. The smoke was from a random forest fire, a cruel trick of nature. When White stepped ashore, he found his worst fears realized, a scene of profound and eerie desolation. The settlement was gone. It was not destroyed by violence. It was meticulously dismantled, taken apart with deliberate purpose. All the houses were gone, vanished. The heavy equipment, the forge, the anvils, gone. The small boats, the pinnaces, gone. He found the chests that he had buried for safekeeping, chests containing his own precious paintings, his maps, his life's work as an artist. They had been dug up, brutally broken open, their precious contents scattered and ruined by the relentless sun and rain. A sign of looting, perhaps, but by whom? There was no sign of a battle, no evidence of a struggle. No bodies, no bloodstains on the ground. No unburied bones bleaching in the sun. No fresh graves. If they had been massacred, where were the 117 dead? It was as if the entire colony had been a mirage, now evaporated without a trace. The colonists, he knew, had a pre-arranged plan. He had discussed it with them before he left. If they had to leave, if they decided to move, they would carve their destination into a tree or post. If they were in distress, if they were forced to leave under duress or attack, they were to carve a Maltese cross, a specific symbol, above the name. He searched frantically, and then he found the carving on a large, prominent palisade post, part of a new, more extensive defensive fence they had built after he left, was a single, clear word, carved in capital letters, CROATOAN. There was no cross. No Maltese cross. CROATOAN. It was the name of Mantio's home island, 50 miles to the south, down the Outer Banks. It was the home of their only remaining allies. The carving was a message. It was not a sign of distress. It was not a cry for help. It was a sign of intent, of deliberate action. They were not captured. They were not dead. They had moved. They had gone to CROATOAN. John White was filled with a wild, soaring hope. He knew where to go. He returned to the ship, and the next morning, they weighed anchor to sail south, to CROATOAN. And then, the weather turned, with a savage, sudden fury. A hurricane, a classic, nor'easter, slammed into the coast with unimaginable force. The fleet was battered, thrown about like toys. They lost their anchors, their lifelines to the seabed. Their cables snapped like thread. They were almost driven ashore and wrecked on the very shoals that had doomed the Tiger years before. The captains of the privateering fleet, who had only reluctantly, grudgingly participated in this rescue, refused to go any further. They had lost their anchors. The sailing season was dangerously late. They had their holds full of loot from the Caribbean. They would not risk their ships, their fortunes, or their lives for a failed colony and a broken old man. They told John White they were leaving. Immediately, they were sailing for England, for home. John White, a utterly broken, defeated man, had no choice, no power, no voice. He stood on the deck of the ship, watching the receding coast of America, the island of CROATOAN, disappear into the storm and the spray. He had been within 50 miles of his family, of his daughter, of his granddaughter. He never returned. He never saw his daughter Eleanor or his granddaughter Virginia Dare again. He died a few years later, in Ireland, a forgotten man, never knowing the ultimate fate of the 117 people he had led to the New World. The colony was officially lost, but the mystery had just begun. Raleigh, his charter expired, his fortune spent, and his favor with the Queen irrevocably lost, never sent another ship. The 117 colonists were officially, and tragically, abandoned to history and to legend. For 400 years, we have been asking one haunting question: what happened to the colonists? The clues are maddeningly few. A single word. No bodies. And a 400-year silence. This silence has been filled with theories, legends, and wild speculation. Theory 1. The Spanish Massacre. This is the most logical, contemporary threat. The Spanish claimed all of North America as their own. They saw the English colony as an illegal incursion, a den of pirates that threatened their treasure routes. They had, in fact, done this before with chilling efficiency. In 1565, they had brutally massacred a French Huguenot colony at Fort Caroline, in Florida, executing nearly every man, woman, and child. They were aggressively looking for Raleigh's Roanoke Colony. We know from detailed Spanish archives that King Philip II was personally obsessed with finding and wiping out this heretical settlement. In 1588, a Spanish ship from St. Augustine, Florida, was specifically sent to find and destroy the colony, but by the time they finally got there, the colonists were already gone. They found only the empty ruins, the ghost town. This theory is politically plausible, but it doesn't fit the physical evidence. John White found no bodies, no skeletons, no signs of a fight, no spent shot, no broken weapons. The houses were carefully dismantled, not burned or shattered by cannon fire. And why would the Spanish, after a successful massacre, take the time to carve the word CROATOAN on a post? It makes no tactical or logical sense. Theory 2. The Native Massacre. This is the most enduring and darkest theory. That Wanchese and his warriors, who had already killed George Howe, finally gathered their strength and overran the weakened colony. This theory gained significant weight 20 years later, with the founding of Jamestown. Captain John Smith, the famous, boastful leader of Jamestown, claimed he spoke to the great paramount chief Powhatan, the father of Pocahontas. Powhatan, Smith said, confessed to him in a moment of boasting. He said he had slaughtered the colonists. He claimed they had abandoned Roanoke and gone to live with the friendly Chesapeake tribe, in the area where John White had originally intended to settle. Powhatan was in the process of building his own empire, the Powhatan Confederacy. Through conquest and diplomacy, an independent, armed group of English settlers, allied with a rival tribe like the Chesapeake, would have been a direct political and military threat he had to eliminate. He claimed he had slain the men, and reserved the women and children, absorbing them into his own tribes. He even produced, Smith claimed, a few European-made objects, an iron axe, a brass mortar, to prove his story. But this too has significant problems. John Smith was a notorious self-promoter, a man who often embellished his adventures. He may have invented or exaggerated the story to impress his bosses in London, to show that he was dealing with a powerful, dangerous chieftain whom only he could manage. And again, it doesn't perfectly fit the evidence at Roanoke. No bodies were ever found. No cross was carved. Why would they meticulously dismantle their houses if they were fleeing for their lives? And why carve CROATOAN, the name of their allies to the south, as a clue, if they were actually planning to go west to the Chesapeake? The massacre theory, like the Spanish theory, leaves too many perplexing questions unanswered, which brings us to theory 3. The one that was literally carved on the post. The one John White himself believed in his heart. The one that is not a story of a sudden vanishing, but of a gradual, deliberate assimilation. The CROATOAN theory. The clue was not a mystery. It was an answer, a forwarding address. John White understood its meaning instantly. They had carved no Maltese cross. This was not a distress signal. It was a message of relocation. Their situation was undoubtedly desperate. They were stranded on a hostile island. They were in the middle of a record-setting, catastrophic drought. Their only allies in the entire world were 50 miles south, on CROATOAN Island, with their trusted friend Manteo. The logical, sensible, human thing to do was to go to them, to seek refuge. They would have dismantled their houses for the valuable wood, the precious nails, the reusable materials, treasures in a land without iron. They would have taken their small boats, and they would have sailed south, down the chain of islands, to join Manteo's people, the CROATOANs. To survive, by any means necessary. This theory seems the most rational, the most likely, but it leaves a different, more haunting, more complex question. If they survived, what happened to them? Where did their 117 English bodies, their DNA, their culture, their language, go. For centuries, the trail went cold. The theory remained just a theory. But the answer may have been hiding in plain sight, in the swamps and communities of North Carolina. The people who live in that part of North Carolina today, the Lumbee tribe, have a powerful, persistent, and detailed oral tradition. Their history begins with their ancestors finding and taking in a group of lost, shipwrecked, or abandoned Englishmen. They tell stories of ancestors who could talk in a book, a powerful, evocative folk memory of literacy, of people who could read and write. For centuries, the Lumbee have been different, an anomaly. They are a native people, but their culture is a unique, fascinating blend. Early explorers and settlers in the 1700s, like John Lawson, were stunned and bewildered to find Lumbee individuals with distinct European features, striking blue or gray eyes, and light brown or even blonde hair. They found them living not in traditional longhouses, but in European style, two-story clapboard houses and speaking a unique form of archaic, 16th-century English, peppered with words long forgotten in Britain. Most telling of all? Their surnames. When English settlers began keeping formal records in the early 1700s, they found Lumbee families with names like Dare, Cooper, Harvey, Sampson, Wright, Taylor, names that were on the original, fateful list of the 117 lost colonists. The evidence is circumstantial, it is anecdotal, but it is deeply, profoundly compelling. It suggests that the lost colony of Roanoke was never truly lost. It simply merged. It became the Lumbee. They assimilated, they intermarried, they created a new, hybrid people. But for a long time, this was just a story. A compelling folk tale, but lacking hard proof. Until now, in the last decade, archaeology has finally, decisively provided a tangible clue. Not on Roanoke Island itself, but on CROATOAN Island, which is today called Hatteras Island. Archaeologists, led by Drive Mark Horton, began a systematic dig, a scientific search for evidence. And they found exactly what they were looking for at a site known as Site X, a large, significant native village that was known to be Matteo's home. They started unearthing European objects mixed seamlessly with native artifacts. But these were not just typical trade goods, like glass beads. They were domestic items, personal possessions. A distinctive piece of a 16th-century English medicine jar, used for ointments. A snap-ons flintlock mechanism, an intricate piece of an English gun. A man's sword hilt, a personal weapon. A lead pencil, for writing or drawing. A small writing slate, for notes. A signet ring, for sealing documents. And, most importantly, numerous fragments of borderware pottery, a common, utilitarian type of pottery used by ordinary English families for cooking and eating, not the kind of high-status item typically used for trade. These objects were not just traded and discarded. They were being used, lived with, repaired, and then discarded inside a native village, at the exact stratigraphic layer corresponding to the time the colonists would have been there. This is the evidence we have waited for centuries. This is the archaeological smoking gun. The Lost Colony of Roanoke is not a story about a magical vanishing act. It's not a ghost story. It's a story of profound human survival. It's the story of 117 people who were abandoned by their country, by their queen, by their backers. Abandoned by their governor and grandfather, who faced starvation, drought, and war, and who made a conscious, deliberate choice. They chose to leave their English world behind. They chose to walk 50 miles south, into the unknown. They chose to join a native tribe, to intermarry, to learn new ways, to become a new people, the first tree melting pot in American history. They didn't just survive. They assimilated. They became, in a very real sense, the first Americans. But the mystery, in its own way, still endures. Because this is not necessarily the complete, final answer. We still don't know the specific, personal stories. What was their daily life like? Did Virginia Dare, the first English child, grow up to marry a CROATOAN man, her blonde hair and blue eyes becoming a family legend? Did Eleanor White Dare ever stop staring at the sea, her heart breaking, waiting for the sail of her father's ship that would never come? And what about the Powhatan Confession? It's possible, even likely, that both theories contain elements of truth. The colony, facing certain starvation, would not have necessarily stayed together as a single, large group. A group of 117 people is too large, too cumbersome, and too hungry to feed easily. It's almost certain they split up, a tragic but practical decision. A main group, perhaps 90 or 100 people, went south to CROATOAN, to the safety of Mantio's people. But a smaller, more adventurous pioneer group, perhaps the single men and the soldiers, may have gone west, inland, to seek their fortune or find the Chesapeake Bay. This brings us to the final, tantalizing, game-changing clue. A map, a 16th-century map of the area, drawn by John White himself. The Virginia Pars map. For 400 years, it was held in the British Museum, studied by countless historians who saw nothing unusual. But in 2012, researchers at the First Colony Foundation, looking at the map with state-of-the-art hyperspectral imaging technology, found something astonishing. Under a small, innocuous patch of paper, which had been used to correct the coastline on the map, was a hidden symbol. A symbol for a fort, drawn in invisible ink, likely a Gallatin ink made from oak galls. It was not at Roanoke. It was not at CROATOAN. It was 50 miles inland, at the confluence of two rivers, the Chowan and the Roanoke, a place the colonists, according to Harriet's notes, had discussed as a potential second colony, a place with rich soil and resources. The patch may have been added later by White or a colleague to hide this secret, fallback location from Spanish spies, should the map be captured. This hidden location is now known as Site X on the mainland. Archaeologists are digging there now, at a place called Salmon Creek. And they are finding things. The same 16th century borderware pottery fragments. A piece of a musket barrel. A rapier hilt. A lead cloth seal from a bale of English cloth. The story is becoming clearer, more complex, and more fascinating. The colonists did not just vanish into thin air. They scattered. They split up, a diaspora of desperation. Some went south to CROATOAN, to assimilation and survival, and some, it seems, went west, inland, to Site X, exactly as Powhatan had claimed to John Smith 2 decades later. It's entirely possible that this smaller, vulnerable inland group was the one Powhatan's warriors slaughtered, eliminating a political rival, while the larger, main group on CROATOAN survived, their bloodline and story merging seamlessly with the people who would become the Lumbee. The Lost Colony of Roanoke is not a single mystery with a single solution. It is a story of 3 destinations: Roanoke, the point of departure; CROATOAN, the place of assimilation; and Site X, the place of a possible, final tragedy. It is a story of a people who, faced with an impossible, existential choice, did not simply lie down and die. They adapted. They persevered. They left their clues for us, carved on a tree for all to see, and hidden on a map for only the most determined to find. And after 400 years of silence, we are finally, just now, beginning to listen to their story.